Hello and good morning. Welcome to what is quite possibly the last lecture for 2020. Uh, I'm not sure if I'll need to record anything more. This is the last lecture we're going to have. The rest of what we're going to work on is basically going to be reviewing for the exam. So what I'd like to do is have you start today with basically kind of doing a quick review on Ronald Reagan. What are three things that we need to know? So if you were going to choose three things to know about Ronald Reagan, what would those three things be? Make sure you explain your answer. We're then going to move on to just two things that I left out from Ronald Reagan. It's kind of big. We're going to talk a little bit about his Middle East policy, and then essentially the big scandal. It's not going to be one that takes him down, but it may have an effect on his legacy. So kind of think about that one as we go through it. We will then move on to the election of 1988 and talk a little bit about George Herbert Walker Bush and basically the end of the Cold War. So I'm going to play around a little bit, sort of get you to the time of your birth through something I mentioned, just so I can feel like we finished the course. But otherwise, that is the end of our of the input material that you need to know. For next time, we will have our Chapter 30 quiz. So it will be the same type of questions as usual, but I'm going to throw in a few more stimulus-based questions just to make sure that you're working with documents, because obviously that's going to be important for that DBQ prompt on the test. So we will have another DBQ practice next Wednesday, 4/22, if you're watching this in 2020, we'll kind of continue on from there as far as what type of reviews, what types of things we're going to need to do to make sure that we're properly prepared for that for that end of the year test. So. To begin today, we'll just play a little bit I'll start a song for you. You can continue it on Spotify. If once you hear the beginning, it was actually from one of my favorite albums from 1987 from the band called X, or the Ex-Catholics as they were once known. See how we are. So we start off now with the with Ronald Reagan's policies in the Middle East, and one of the things that is going to be kind of a shaper regarding the Middle East policy is the country of Lebanon. Back then, Lebanon was very much divided. It was in a civil war regarding how its constitution and whatnot was being constructed, on which religious groups had power, and what that led to was a lack of governance, particularly in the southern part of Lebanon. This allowed a terrorist group by the name of Hezbollah to essentially kind of act out of that area and essentially attack Israel. Well, in 1982, Israel will counterattack. They're going to invade Lebanon, essentially to try and defend themselves. Well, to try and bring some stability to Lebanon, Ronald Reagan is going to send in troops in 1983, peacekeepers. this was kind of this is kind of interesting specifically to me that year. 1983 is the year that I am going to turn 18. And so my so-called friends that year gave me a T-shirt. Actually, one of my friends was a manager of a T-shirt shop, and on it said Beirut or bust, and it was on a shirt kind of like the one that I'm wearing now, olive drab. And so because 18-year-old males have to register for the draft. But our policies in the Middle East, it turns out to be somewhat tragic, because there is going to be a terrorist attack. A truck bomb is driven into the barracks in Lebanon, and explosion is going to kill somewhere around 200 Marines. If you look at the pictures to the right, you can see some headlines from New York Times, but more importantly, that picture up there, and you see something that's kind of raising out in the background. You go, oh, wow, is that trees? That is smoke from the bomb that you're looking at there. But interestingly enough, this event is going to be somewhat pivotal in how Americans are going to be regarded by terrorist groups in the Middle East, because what Ronald Reagan's response is to pull our troops out of Beirut, which for some people believe is that this was a signal that this is what you need to do in the United States. If you want to mess with the United States, you bomb them and they'll leave. The other thing that is going to be kind of a shaper as far as the United States is concerned is, once again, in affecting American policy with Israel. In 1987, Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip are going to be in what was known as the Intifada now. We call it the First Intifada now, because there will be others after it. But this uprising there is essentially going to inspire a crackdown by Israel, and then how the United States reacts to that is going to be kind of how the United States is judged by the neighboring countries in the Middle East. So this brings us to what is, the big scandal. It seems like most presidents in the, in this recent era, there's going to be scandals that are going to happen under their watch, particularly in their second terms. A streak that, at least up until this point that we know about it, was broken by Barack Obama. But anyway, the scandal for Ronald Reagan was something known as the Iran-Contra affair. And to understand this, there's quite a bit of context that you have to kind of have in your brain. First of all, knowing that at this point, this war, 8-year war that was happening between Iran and Iraq. And so, two countries which were really not, particularly Iran, remember, had taken hostages from the United States. Iraq had been somewhat supported by the Soviet Union at times. And so these two countries fighting with one another, the United States was kind of going, yeah, go ahead. Anyway, so these two countries are fighting. And then we have kind of continuance of that instability that was happening in Lebanon. And what will happen is American hostages are going to be taken there. And the policy for the United States is we will not negotiate with terrorists. So this thing is that publicly the United States is not going to do anything about these hostages, right? Yet the fact that they're taken is obviously going to affect the United States. Anyway, the third thing, and it's removed from the Middle East, but it is going to have to do with this this scandal, is that closer to home, there was a country known as Nicaragua, which had a group that was ruling it that had socialist leanings. They were the followers of Sandino, or the Sandinistas, and led by a guy by the name of Daniel Ortega. And essentially this socialist leaning group was opposed by a group in Nicaragua known as Contras. Well, the Reagan administration was trying to funnel arms, trying to funnel weapons to the Contras to basically try and bring down this socialist leaning government. Well, the United States Congress is going to try and stop that. They passed a law saying that no money could go to the Contras. Essentially, this is a kind of remnant of the reaction to the Vietnam War. Because if you recall in Vietnam, it all started with supporting South Vietnam, and then it got bigger. And so everybody was kind of in a mode of no more Vietnams at that time. And so stop, do not send money to the Contras. I remember when I was in college, people were wearing these orange stickers, okay, or pasting. There was stickers all over notebooks, stickers all over the walls that said, or there were orange stickers, and they said no Contra aid, because people didn't want to know Vietnam. Anyway, so it's at this point that the Reagan administration is going to kind of do a little bit of subterfuge. They are going to try and figure out a way of dealing with this hostage situation in Lebanon. And essentially what they came up with is that kind of a bending of the rules of not negotiating with terrorists. What we were going to do is we were going to send weapons to Iran. And essentially, what we were going to rely on was the good graces of Iran to have some sort of contact with the terrorist Hezbollah that held the hostages, and this weapon sale, the fact that they're getting these weapons that they could use against Iraq, would help us get hostages released. And yes, it did work. Some hostages were released because of this program. Problem is, you can already figure it out. Other hostages are taken, and in effect, you almost set up this thing as like, what do you get when you take hostages? It basically had this phrase, arms for hostages. Anyway, but there's a part two. So money, so it's a sale. So money is given back to the United States for in this weapons sale. And in the eyes of the Reagan administration, was that this money was off the books. It's like, what? We sold it. We sold the weapons to Iran, and all of a sudden this secret money is coming back to the United States. And so what the Reagan administration will do is they will send that money to the Contras. Okay? What? You can't, obviously the law wasn't supposed to cover that. It wasn't supposed to cover secret money. Well, this whole scandal, well, I guess it becomes a scandal because this whole plot unravels. First of all, we get wind of the fact that there was this arms for hostages going on, and then B, this violation of American law, that no money was supposed to go to the Contras, and somewhere in there we may have even been negotiating with terrorists. Anyway, several administration figures are going to be indicted here. The Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberg, the Director of the National Security Agency, Admiral John Poindexter, and his assistant, okay, a lieutenant colonel who's acting as an advisor to the national security advisor, a guy by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Oliver. And essentially what will happen is Congress is going to want to get to the big fish. They want to get to the Secretary of Defense. They want to get to the President of the United States as being involved in this plot, involved in this scandal. And so what they're going to do is they're going to offer people like John Poindexter, in particular Oliver North, hey, we will give you immunity for anything you say in this in hearings that happen before the United States Congress. And so Oliver North basically is going to essentially come up with the kind of almost a perfect plan. He will go to Congress and he will say, yeah, I came up with the whole plan on my own. I was authorized, but all of it's my idea. And what's made this, when he goes on trial later, none of what he was supposed to have said have been in these hearings were supposed to be used against him, and they essentially could not show that they had independent knowledge of where anything happened besides his testimony. So he will end up having his conviction on these charges being quashed by the Supreme Court. Perhaps the two last things that kind of come out of the scandal that were most important is that the president, he is asked, what do you know? When did you know it? He's pretty much saying, I don't remember. I don't know. And, there were some people who were like, when they heard about this response, screaming at the television, what do you mean you don't remember? But it will come to light later that this is actually right at the beginning of when Ronald Reagan was starting to showing signs of Alzheimer's. So, anyway, in the end, pretty much the whole scandal goes away, even though there had been a special prosecutor involved and everything like that, because the guy who gets elected president, a little spoiler alert here, in the election of 1988 is George Bush, the Vice President of the United States, and George Bush, the Vice President of the United States, will end up pardoning pretty much anybody else who was involved, particularly the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberg. So take a look or kind of think back on these last kind of Middle East issues. And does the Middle East, does the Iran-Contra affair, do you think that has an effect on or an impact on Ronald Reagan's legacy? So one to answer that question up, play for you another my top albums from the time period. An album self-titled album by Tracy Chapman, and the song is called Love. I do the baby star, there's enough food to feed the world. So now we're on to the election of 1988, and setting up for this election. I mean, things are starting to kind of fall apart for the Republicans. The Republicans lose control of the United States Senate in 1986, and what we'll start to see is kind of the beginning of this super partisanship that we now see in the United States Supreme Court. Back then, instead of being Republicans, it was the Democrats, and the president is going to attempt to fill a seat in the United States Supreme Court with a guy by the name of Robert Bork. And Robert Bork was actually when Richard Nixon was trying to have the special prosecutor fired back during the Watergate scandal. Robert Bork was Solicitor General and was the one who ended up firing Archibald Cox. Anyway, Robert Bork was known as a very conservative choice, and United States Senate is going to vote him down. And this is, this wasn't done a lot. I mean, a couple of Richard Nixon's choices have been voted down, but largely because they had been in favor of segregation. But this is really just based on political views, and the Democratic Senate says no. In fact, they will now use this name, Robert Bork, and say that what happened to him is he got borked, and when the Republicans get into power later and they start this same kind of partisan blocking people because of their views, they are basically saying we are borking back. Additionally, the administration is locked in that scandal. We just talked about the Iran-Contra scandal. We're also facing economic troubles again. We have, in this term at the time, they used it. It feels a little bit more ominous now, but we called it the Twin Towers of deficit. We had this massive trade deficit as we were importing far more than we were exporting, and we had this massive trillion this budget deficit and national debt in trillions now. It was just, oh my, it was mind-boggling. Additionally, the economy is starting to show some weakness. Interesting enough, as fuel prices were starting to go down, starting to hurt the economies in oil economy states, particularly Texas, and also affecting the state of California. Additionally, one of the things that had happened during this expansion that had started back in 1983, one of the things that people had been buying up was a lot of real estate. We were buying buildings, we were buying shopping malls, and what will happen is that they overbought. And so we start to get falling real estate prices. So prices are starting to go down on properties. Things are going down on houses, but that hurts if you had bought a mortgage, let's say, on that property, and now your house is worthless. So the economy is weakening. Additionally, we start to see weakness in the savings and loan. Now, remember back when we talked about the Great Depression, one of the things that was shored up because of Glass-Steagall were the banks. Well, many of the regulations and whatnot that were in Glass-Steagall toward banks did not necessarily apply to savings and loans. And what had happened is that savings and loans were starting to take people's money, and they started investing it poorly. Particularly, they were investing in Latin American countries that would then become insolvent and not pay it back. And so those people lost their money. The Reagan administration is going to end up having to spend some $500 billion bailing out the savings and loans industry to protect the savings accounts of Americans across the country. Additionally, what had happened during the big boom that had started in 1983 was companies were buying other companies. These huge mergers, and there was a lot of the government looking the other way while these companies were getting so big, because essentially starting with Jimmy Carter and continued with Ronald Reagan, we started deregulated. We started making so governments weren't watching as much. And what happened with these mergers is that these companies started to become big, and people started, oh man, we got to invest in these companies, and the stock market just starts going up. But as we see the weaknesses in the economy because of the savings and loans crisis, because of the fuel price changes, because of the real estate issues, all of a sudden that bubble pops. And on October 19th, yeah, these things seem to always happen in October. And on October 19th, the Dow Jones Industrial Average will have the largest until 2007, 2008 downturn of the stock market, as it fell 508 points in 1987. So, you want to run for president? Well, the weakness in the economy and kind of the dwindling stature of Ronald Reagan that was happening because of the Iran-Contra scandal is going to make it so that everyone's run for president. That's 7 people, and that number seems paltry compared to what we saw going into the election in 2020. But at the time, we got 7 candidates from the Democratic Party, all kind of vying for the candidacy. The problem is that the Democrats kind of been out of power, big power, for a while now. These Democrats weren't very well known. And so the press always looking for ways of describing, groups of people. They came up with a term. They called these 7 Democratic candidates the 7 dwarfs. Well, I don't know if you can have a head dwarf, but the front runner was out of Arizona, senator out of Arizona. His name was Gary Hart. And Gary Hart was, as he was leading, there were news reports about possible infidelity on his part. And the response of Gary Hart is going to be one of those things of, oh yeah, you're saying this about me, kind of prove it. Really? Anyway, what will end up happening is there was this magazine known as the National Enquirer, followed later by People magazine, which I used the picture from here. But the National Enquirer is going to take that challenge very seriously and basically get pictures of Gary Hart not wearing very much clothes, with a woman that was not his wife, wearing not very much clothes, doing things that people wearing not very much clothes do. And so these pictures are splashed all over the tablet, first in the National Enquirer, later in People magazine. And essentially, boom, he's gone from the race. The kind of the next guy who really kind of picks up notoriety, I'm not sure if he really became the front runner, but he was Jesse Jackson. Jesse Jackson was kind of the heir apparent of Dr. King in the big known thing for the civil rights movement. He had a great kind of idea in his campaign. He called it the Rainbow Coalition, that everybody's coming together here. It kind of goes to rights liberalism and all the different groups demanding, trying to achieve equal rights in America, all coming together to become one powerful entity. It's the candidate that I was actually ending up supporting for a while in going into the June primary in California. It was right as I was graduating from Cal Poly, and I remember on my graduation gown I had this big, it was actually a larger pen than this, for Jesse Jackson. My sisters, when they saw the pen, they were, "What are you trying to do? Give Dad a heart attack?" And of course, that's the age where you kind of smile and go movie. Anyway, Jesse Jackson, however, his candidacy doesn't gain enough steam, and the final dwarf to emerge is going to be Michael Dukakis, the governor of Massachusetts. His lieutenant governor, you might recognize his name, was John Kerry. What Dukakis ran on was something known as the Massachusetts Miracle. That as the economy was going downward everywhere else, hey, great economy in Massachusetts. Republicans are going to run George Herbert Walker Bush, Ronald Reagan's vice president. And essentially what he ran on was he was in the room. he was the vice president for Ronald Reagan. And even though many of the positions that he's going to take in this election were different than the ones that he had in the past, like in this election, he is going to be anti-abortion, whereas in the past he had been pro-choice. In the past, he had been critical of Ronald Reagan's economic policies, calling them voodoo economics. Well, no, not anymore. Okay, he is going to run on those tax cuts. He's going to run on strong defense. He's going to run on toughness on crime. He's going to run on opposition to abortion. He's going to run on, well, I was there when the economy expanded. And essentially, what had started out as a massive lead by Michael Dukakis in the summer of 1988, you see it's just basically falling apart. Okay, and there are a couple things that kind of help it fall apart. On that toughness on crime thing, Bush is going to target Michael Dukakis with an ad that was known as the Billy Horton ad. There had been a policy in place in Massachusetts where they would let criminals that practice good behavior, they could go out on furloughs, weekend passes from jail. Well, this one candidate, Willie Horton, Prisoner Willie Horton, was on a crime spree while he's on this path. And the way that the Republicans ran this ad is that basically it kind of listed all the crimes that happened, and then it had this picture kind of ominously coming on the screen. And of course, Willie Horton was African American, and you can see what the implications were of the ad. The second one had to do with defense, and the Democrats had done a massive mistake. They had tried to do an ad where Dukakis was in a tank, and, showing that he would be in favor of strong defense. The problem is the imagery was poor. You had this you had Dukakis in this with his little head in this giant tank man helmet that sticking out of the tank like this, and it just looked absolutely ridiculous. And so the Republicans basically take that same footage from the ad and they just run it with a list of all the different cuts in defense that the Democrats were proposing. In the end, Bush will slam Dukakis, essentially winning more than 400 electoral votes. What are your thoughts? Could you write for me right now? What are your thoughts regarding the election of 1988? And we'll just kind of move on a little bit culturally with the music that's starting to show up in the late 80s.
All the same, no matter time or place. They don't understand that us kids are going to make some mistakes. You other kids all across the land, there's no need to argue. Parents just don't understand.
So Ronald Reagan is leaving, and the guy who becomes president of the United States is George Herbert Walker Bush. Bush's background is he is from a rich family. He is the wealthy son of Senator Prescott Bush out of Connecticut. But he had moved to Texas, and he'd tried to essentially kind of gain more of a Texas personality as opposed to his wealthy Connecticut upbringing. He's also somebody who was very much committed to public service. His whole life, he had served as a congressman. He had served as an emissary to China. He had served as the ambassador to the United Nations. But he also was director of the CIA. And of course, he was Ronald Reagan's vice president. When Bush came into office, he tried to take kind of this impression of conservatives as not having as much of a heart, and he tries to dispel it. He promised that he would have a kinder and gentler America. And he actually is going to help push through some groundbreaking legislation for one of the groups that often discriminated against in America, and that is the disabled. He pushes through the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1991. But he also aggravated some of the other social issues of the day. He came out as anti-affirmative action. He came out anti-abortion, which made a couple of the groups in the Democratic coalition, it was, kind of coalesce against him. He also is going to make a nomination to the United States Supreme Court. And it was to replace Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall thought that he'd be able to outlast the Bush administration. He gets increasingly ill, and finally steps down from the court. And who's going to be nominated, or who's going to get nominated to replace him, is another African American male by the name of Clarence Thomas. But he had more conservative views. He was anti-affirmative action. But what made it particularly troubling for Bush's administration was that as they were going through the hearings for for Clarence Thomas, a law professor by the name of Anita Hill, will bring forth allegations that that Clarence Thomas had sexually harassed her when they were basically when they had worked together. And this brings this issue before the United States Senate. The hearings, which had just been brought to a close regarding Clarence Thomas by the Senate, are reopened. But when you looked at these hearings, it was like all of these guys in the Senate looking at this woman, Anita Hill, as she is basically giving testimony. Clarence Thomas kind of plays the race card as he in his response here. He will call the allegations and things against him at this point. He called it a high-tech lynching. And he ends up getting confirmed and still is on the United States Supreme Court to this day. Bush is also going to be hurt by the fact that this recession is continuing. Unemployment is going to raise in California. It goes to 10% in California because the defense industry is going to be hurt by what we're going to talk about in a minute, the end of the Cold War. But it's 7% across the country, and this is going to lead later to a guy who, when he runs against him for president in '92, he's going to say it's the economy, stupid. Anyway, but it's also going to lead to kind of, I guess we're going to call it an error that Bush is going to make. When he was running on the economy and everything that Ronald Reagan had done, including tax cuts, he had made this statement that people kind of took as a pledge, where when people say, okay, to balance the budget, are you going to raise taxes? And he said, read my lips, no new taxes. And man, that little soundbite, it will come back to haunt him later, because when he's trying to deal with the budget shortfalls, he will agree to increasing taxes, which obviously will be thrown against him. So the other topic, as far as foreign policy was concerned, George Bush just turns out to be in the right place at the right time. He is essentially going to be there as the world kind of shifts out of the communist dominated world that it had been, maybe less. Okay, it kind of begins in China, where early in 1989, you're going to see these protests in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, near the Heavenly Peace Gate, and these demonstrations, Chinese students, with little statues of liberty and placards and calling for freedom, and Americans are going, look, people in China want to be like America. Well, it was kind of, it was kind of heartwarming, watching it on the news and everything like that. However, Chinese government was going to have none of it, and despite this fabulous picture, if you see it over here on the right, where you see this student that's standing in front of tanks as if its very presence was going to stop the tanks rolling. Well, on June 4th in 1989, 1989. Those tanks rolled in. The protest is quashed, but it's almost as if a genie had been released from the bottle, because there will be anti-communist demonstrations now throughout the world for the rest of the year. Essentially, Eastern Europe is going to be transformed by the end of the year, as Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Romania are all going to basically kind of push back against their communist rulers. In December of 1989, the Germans are going to be dancing on the Berlin Wall, and the wall's going to get turned down. And this is where where I really do see kind of a difference between y'all and me, as far as what's important in your life and whatnot. In your lifetime, you live in a world where there has never been a Berlin Wall in your lifetime. But a huge chunk of my life, this was in the category of walls that are. Okay, Great Wall of China, Berlin Wall, things that are. So for me, I still am just, dumbfounded that this thing is down. You go to the Reagan Library, the Nixon Library, you'll see chunks of this wall that sent here to the United States. It's not wrong. Germany is going to reunite in 1990, and this again, to me, I literally, when I was, when you had to color maps when you were a kid, I had to color the map that had the two Germanys. So East Germany, okay, West Germany, and now it's just simply Germany. Well, essentially, it's the Soviet Union which sees this kind of anti-communist genie hit next. And what basically happens is those policies by Mikhail Gorbachev, Perestroika, and Glasnost, well, essentially, they surge out of control. In 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev almost finds himself to be the victim of a coup, almost removed from power by Soviet hardliners. In fact, is rescued largely by the presence of the president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, who will end up emerging as the new strong man in the now former Soviet Union. Basically, the Soviet Union devolves into its component parts. It had been one big country, now it's 11 republics. Well, the Soviet Union's collapse is going to bring up huge questions, because what does it mean? Okay, when we face the Soviet Union, okay, one country was in control of all these nukes pointed at the United States. Well, now all these different republics, do they all get nukes too? Have we proliferated the number of countries that have nuclear weapons? And you go, yay, and the communists, boo, whatever. What about the nukes? Would Russia, if they indeed end up being in control, and they do, we think, control of all of those nukes, would Russia honor all the treaties that the Soviet Union had signed, or do we have to now start all over again and do new treaties with Russia? The other thing, that Russia no longer being in control, well, it meant control. And so there are things that have been bottled up for years, ethnic groups that had been pitted against each other, but no, they're not pitted when the Russians are telling them to stop. No one's telling them to stop. And so you end up with these ethnic clashes throughout now the former Soviet Union. Well, in America, there was something that was supposed to be joyful. Now, that the Soviet Union is no longer the big enemy, and we've been building up all the weapons against the Soviet Union. Well, does that mean that we can stop? Can we now take all that money? Can we take all that money that we were using to build up our weapons and everything like that? Can we now use it in another way? Would there be a peace dividend? Ooh, well, what does this mean? Because part of how this whole military thing was done is that there were military bases across the country. There were companies that had contracts to build the weapons, and now all of a sudden you're saying, okay, we don't need that military base anymore. Well, what happens to the community that was surrounding that military base and relied upon the money generated by that military base? So which ones are you going to close? Are you going to close the ones in my state? Or are you going to close the ones in your state? This becomes these battles, and they had to set up these special commissions to try and make the pain be felt evenly across the country. But obviously, it's also political. So whoever dominated in Congress would dominate the getting to keep the military goodies. Arms control contracts. Well, in California, our economy was so much based on building the weapons. Well, if we're not building the weapons, all of a sudden these companies that had been generating so much money for the California economy for so long, they're laying people off. My dad, who this has been our family's bread and butter my entire lifetime. Well, he's going to be offered early retirement. Okay. You can move along now because we don't need that anymore. Let's close out today. George Bush as president of the United States. So on foreign policy, he is looked at, rather well. I mean, largely because he just is there standing. As we get the end of the Cold War, essentially he gets to say, "You're welcome." But there were some other things that did happen under his presidency, which also kind of helped elevate his stature as a foreign policy leader. And one of them was what was known as the Persian Gulf crisis. Now, part of this goes back to that conflict that had happened between Iran and Iraq. The United States, when we had sent things to Iran, we also actually sent things to Iraq in their war. So we were giving things to both sides. Perhaps, hey, go ahead, kill each other. Okay. Well, the leader in Iraq was a guy by the name of Saddam Hussein. And in August of 1990, and this is time for me. I've just graduated from college now and have gotten my teaching credential. I had moved to Los Angeles. I was working as a substitute teacher by day, and I was waiting tables by night. If you've ever been to that Marie Callender's on National Boulevard in West LA, that's where I worked. Anyway, at this point, the ambassador from the United States is going to be summoned in by Saddam Hussein, and he basically tells her that he was going to invade Kuwait. His argument was, if you saw the movie There Will Be Blood, the argument is that Iraq and Kuwait basically sit on top of the same oil well, and both of them were pumping oil out, and essentially what the Iraqis claimed was that Kuwait was overtaking the amount that they should. That they're sipping a whole bunch of that extra oil that from what should be Iraq's oil, and the only way to really make it stop is make them stop. Well, the mistake that the American ambassador is going to make is that she is not going to vehemently say, no, don't do it, that's a dumb idea, okay? And because she doesn't just strenuously object, um, Saddam Hussein kind of takes it as a wink. Go ahead. Well, on August 2nd, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. On August 3rd, there is a vote in the United Nations to condemn, okay, the actions of Iraq, an embargo is going to be placed on Iraq, and the United States, of course, is going to be among those who are supporting these actions that to protect Kuwait from Iraq. Well, there's a standoff, and the United States ends up being kind of the leader in this standoff, which again, this is really the first time since the Korean War that you've got some uniting in the Security Council as to who needed to be condemned. And as these countries are all kind of united against Iraq, Iraq is just standing defiantly, will not withdraw. And so an ultimatum is issued largely by the United States that Iraq had until January 15th, 1991 to withdraw or else. Iraq did not withdraw. And on August 16th, 1991, the Allies are going to attack. And it starts off as kind of this air war on what we could watch. And we could watch a lot of it on television because somehow or another CNN had a station in the middle of Baghdad and was sending out footage of exactly what it looked like. And so on our television screens, it looked like like a video game as the United States is just pummeling Baghdad. I remember I had to go off to work and wait my tables that night, and I just kept leaving my tables. I'm so sorry if your parents were customers of mine that night, but I didn't pay attention. I just kept going to the back room to listen to the radio, see what was going on, because here it was, really for the first time in my lifetime, really, the United States was at war. We've done sent troops places, but this was war. Anyway, well, we followed up this air war with an invasion with troops and tanks, mainly tanks, and by February 27th, the Saddam Hussein is going to accept a ceasefire. Kuwait has been liberated, and here's the thing that George Bush had done, though, is that he had been very clear as to what his goals were in this war. Now, obviously, one of the reasons for this is, once again, the hangover from the Vietnam War, which is that, we're not going to get stuck in a quagmire. We're going to very much say that our goal is to liberate Kuwait, and we liberated Kuwait. Well, what they did is they left Saddam Hussein in control in Iraq. And he kind of ends up being in this very defiant position where the United States is going to have the special no-fly zones. We're going to be sending in people to inspect whether or not he was developing special weapons. And throughout this entire period, from the end of this war, Saddam Hussein is going to be somewhat defiant. Okay. Well, two things. One, for George Bush, ending the war actually turns out to be kind of the, hey, you won and we're going home, we like it. And so he presided over the fall of communism. He wins this war. Okay, he should skate to victory in the election of 1992. But remember, his opponent in 1992 is going to say, it's not this, it's the economy, stupid. And that turned out to be the right call. Anyway, as far as Iraq was concerned, that defiance will continue throughout the presidency of the guy who comes after George Bush, William, but you can call me Bill Clinton. And basically, this situation is going to be presented to the guy who comes after Clinton, who turns out to be George Herbert Walker's son, George Walker Bush. And in the aftermath of the attack on the Twin Towers in 2001, the United States goes to war with in Afghanistan to try and capture the villain there, Osama bin Laden. But there had been stories that had been going on for years that Saddam Hussein had been developing weapons of mass destruction. He had been pushing out people to inspect on whether or not he was. And it will be George Bush's son that will take us back to war in 2003. Well, this is where we're going to leave the lectures. By 2003, most of y'all have been born. You're here on Earth. So as far as lectures are concerned, I'm going to say that, and they all lived happily ever after. But for me, one more thing. A question. So I told you about the presidency of George Herbert Walker Bush. I call him here Bush the First. Your last thing for today is to evaluate him, his presidency, give him a grade, give me a reason why you gave him that grade, and will your play out music instead of having us Don't Stop Thinking About Tomorrow by Fleetwood Mac, we will go with a little bit of U2.